Shaquille O'Neal finds his life-changing mentor. After 30 years, I would be nothing without you. Are you ready to witness one of the most emotional reunions in sports history? Today, you're going to discover an incredible story about Shaquille O'Neal and the mentor who changed everything for him 3 decades ago. This is a tale of gratitude, perseverance, and the power of believing in someone when they need it most. If this story touches your heart, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss these inspiring stories. Now, let's dive into this remarkable journey that will leave you believing in the power of human connection. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Shaquille O'Neal's Atlanta mansion as he sat in his home office, reviewing contracts for his latest business venture. At 52, the Basketball Hall of Famer had built an empire that extended far beyond the hardwood floors where he once dominated. Television shows, restaurants, real estate investments, Shaq had his hands in everything. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Urgent call from Louisiana State University. They say it's about Coach Coleman. Shaq's massive frame tensed as he read the name he hadn't heard in years. Coach Robert Coleman, Bobby, to those who knew him. The man who had seen something in a gangly, uncertain teenager from San Antonio nearly 30 years ago when Shaq was just starting at LSU. "Put the call through," Shaq said, his voice unusually quiet. "Mr. O'Neal?" The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Sarah Mitchell, LSU's athletic director. "I'm calling about Coach Robert Coleman. I know you might not remember him, but..." "Remember him," Shaq interrupted, leaning back in his leather chair. "Lady, I think about that man every single day." "What's happened?" There was a pause. "Coach Coleman is in hospice care here in Baton Rouge. He's been asking for you. His family found some old letters you wrote to him over the years and, well, he's been talking about you constantly. The doctors don't think he has much time left." Shaq's eyes closed as memories flooded back. Bobby Coleman hadn't been his head coach. That was Dale Brown. Bobby was an assistant coach, a quiet man in his 50s who worked with the big men. While other coaches focused on Shaq's obvious physical gifts, Bobby had seen something different. A young man struggling with self-doubt, trying to find his place in a world that expected him to be perfect, simply because he was 7 feet tall. "Ali, be there today," Shaq said, without hesitation. "What hospital?" "Actually, he's at home. His wife, Margaret, insisted on home hospice. I can send you the address." After hanging up, Shaq sat in silence for several minutes. His mind drifted back to 1989, when he was just 17 years old, scared and homesick in Louisiana. Bobby Coleman had been the one to notice when Shaq would sit alone in the cafeteria, the one who stayed after practice to work on fundamentals, but, more importantly, the one who talked to him like a person, not just a basketball prospect. Within 2 hours, Shaq was on his private jet, heading toward Baton Rouge. As Louisiana's familiar landscape appeared below, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through old contacts until he found it. Bobby Coleman's number, saved but unused for far too long. The flight attendant noticed the big man wiping his eyes. "Everything okay, Mr. O'Neal?" "Just going to see an old friend," Shaq replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Someone I should have visited a long time ago." If you're feeling the emotion of this reunion already, please show your support by hitting the like button. This story gets even more powerful, and you won't want to miss what happens when these two finally meet again after 3 decades. The Uber driver, a middle-aged black man named Jerome, recognized his passenger immediately as they drove through the familiar streets of Baton Rouge. Shaquille O'Neal in my car, he chuckled, glancing in the rearview mirror. My wife ain't gonna believe this. You heading to see family? Something like that, Shaq replied, watching the city roll by. LSU's campus appeared in the distance, and with it, a flood of memories. You know, I haven't been back here in probably 5 years. Man, you put this city on the map back in the day. I was at the game when you dunked so hard you broke the backboard. The whole Pete Maravich Assembly Center went crazy. Shaq smiled, but his mind was elsewhere. As they drove through the neighborhoods surrounding campus, he remembered the countless times Bobby Coleman had driven him through these same streets. Not for official recruiting visits or team functions, but just to talk. Bobby had understood that Shaq needed more than basketball instruction. He needed guidance on becoming a man. The house was a modest single-story home in a quiet subdivision, the kind of neighborhood where teachers and coaches could afford to raise their families. Shaq's heart pounded as he approached the front door, a bouquet of flowers in one massive hand. Before he could knock, the door opened. Margaret Coleman stood there, her silver hair neatly styled, her eyes immediately filling with tears. She was smaller than Shaq remembered, but her warm smile was exactly the same. Shaquille, she whispered, reaching up to embrace him as best she could manage given their height difference. Bobby's been waiting for you. Mrs. Coleman, I'm so sorry I haven't. Don't you apologize for anything, she interrupted, leading him inside. You've been living your life, just like Bobby always wanted. He's so proud of everything you've accomplished. The living room had been converted into a makeshift hospital room. Medical equipment hummed quietly in the corner, but it was clearly a space filled with love. Photos covered every surface, family pictures, old LSU team photos, and prominently displayed several pictures of Shaq from his college days and NBA career. Bobby Coleman lay in a hospital bed positioned to face the large window overlooking the backyard. At 82, he was frailer than Shaq remembered, but his eyes, those sharp, kind eyes that had seen potential in so many young men, were still bright with intelligence. Well, I'll be damned, Bobby said, his voice raspy but strong with emotion. There's my big fella. Shaq approached the bed, and for a moment, the 7'1" NBA legend felt like that uncertain teenager again. Coach Bobby, he said, his voice cracking slightly. None of that coach stuff, Bobby replied, extending a thin hand that Shaq gently took in both of his. Just Bobby. We're both old men now. Margaret brought a chair, reinforced, she noted with a knowing smile, and Shaq sat beside the bed. For several minutes, neither man spoke. They just looked at each other. 3 decades of life passing between them in silent understanding. You know, Bobby finally said, I kept every article about you, every game recap, every business deal, every TV show. Margaret got tired of me cutting out newspapers. I kept your letters, Shaq admitted, every single one, even the ones from when I was being stupid in Orlando, thinking I knew everything. Bobby laughed, a sound that quickly turned into a cough. You weren't stupid, son. You were just young and talented and had the whole world telling you how great you were. I was worried you might forget who you really were underneath all that. Never forgot, Shaq said firmly. Every big game, every championship, every time someone called me great, I thought about what you told me. Greatness isn't about how big you are, Shaquille. It's about how big your heart is. Margaret, who had been quietly organizing medical supplies, paused to wipe her own eyes. She had heard her husband mention Shaquille O'Neal thousands of times over the years, but seeing them together, she finally understood the depth of their connection. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, Bobby and Shaq settled into a rhythm of conversation that felt as natural as if they'd spoken yesterday. Margaret brought sweet tea and homemade cookies, treating Shaq exactly like she had when he was a college student who would occasionally join their family for Sunday dinner. "Tell me about the kids," Bobby said, his eyes brightening. "I've seen them on TV with you. They look like good kids." Shaq's face lit up as he pulled out his phone, showing Bobby recent photos of his children. 6 kids, Bobby. And I try to raise them the way you taught me, with respect, with humility, with understanding that their success is a gift that comes with responsibility. That's what I want to hear, Bobby nodded approvingly. You remember what I used to tell you about being blessed with size? God gave you this body for a reason, Shaquille, Shaq recited from memory. But he's watching to see what you do with it. You can use it to hurt people or to help people. That choice defines who you are. Bobby's eyes misted over. You listened. Even when you were 19 and thought you knew everything, you listened. I listened because you were the first person who talked to me, like I was more than just a basketball player, Shaq said, leaning forward in his chair. Everyone else saw 7 feet and 280 pounds and saw dollar signs. You saw a scared kid who missed his mom and didn't know if he belonged in college. The room fell quiet, except for the gentle hum of medical equipment. Margaret sat in the corner, quietly knitting, but Shaq could see her listening to every word. I've got to ask you something that's been bothering me for 30 years, Shaq said suddenly. Why me? You could have focused on any player. Hell, there were guys who were more coachable, who didn't complain as much. Why did you invest so much time in me? Bobby was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the oak trees in his backyard. You want the honest truth? Always. Because you reminded me of my son. Shaq's eyebrows rose in surprise. He'd known the Colemans had lost a child. Margaret had mentioned it once, briefly. But Bobby had never talked about it. Michael would have been about your age, Bobby continued, his voice softer now. He died in a car accident when he was 16, senior in high school, full scholarship to play football at Tulane. He was big like you. But more than that, he had this way of carrying himself like he was apologizing for taking up space. Margaret's knitting needles stopped clicking. When I first saw you at practice, Bobby went on, hunched over like you were trying to make yourself smaller, apologizing every time you accidentally bumped into someone. I saw Michael, and I thought, this young man needs someone to tell him it's okay to be who God made him to be. Shaq felt tears streaming down his face. In all the years he'd known Bobby Coleman, the man had never mentioned his personal loss or connected it to their relationship. Bobby, I had no idea. Wasn't your burden to carry, Bobby said firmly. But helping you find your confidence, watching you grow into the man you became, it gave me purpose again. Made me feel like maybe Michael's spirit was working through the good we could do together. The three of them sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Bobby spoke again. There's something else I need to tell you, son. Something I've been waiting 30 years to say. Bobby struggled to sit up straighter in his bed, and Shaq immediately moved to help him, adjusting pillows with the gentle care of someone who had learned tenderness despite his imposing size. What I'm about to tell you, Bobby began, his voice taking on a serious tone. I probably should have told you years ago, but I was scared it might make you feel like our relationship wasn't genuine. Shaq felt a flutter of anxiety. Bobby, whatever it is, just listen, son. Bobby's weathered hand found Shaq's again, gripping it with surprising strength. That first year you were at LSU, you were struggling. Not just with basketball, but with everything. Your grades, your confidence, fitting in with the team. You, remember? Shaq nodded. His freshman year had been one of the most difficult periods of his life. The expectations were enormous, but his preparation had been lacking. He'd considered transferring multiple times. There was a meeting, Bobby continued, with the athletic department, the coaching staff, some boosters. They were talking about your future, whether LSU was the right fit. Some people thought maybe you'd be better off at a junior college for a year or two, get your academics together. Margaret had stopped pretending to knit and was now listening intently, as if hearing this story for the first time herself. I stood up in that meeting, Bobby said, his voice growing stronger with the memory. And I told them they were making the biggest mistake in LSU basketball history if they gave up on you. I said you weren't just going to be a good player. You were going to be one of the greatest players who ever lived, and more importantly, one of the finest men I'd ever coached. Bobby, Shaq started, but the older man held up his hand. I wasn't done. I told them that if they were serious about letting you go, I'd quit. I'd walk away from coaching rather than be part of giving up on a young man with your potential. Bobby's eyes were bright with tears now. I bet my career on you, Shaquille, and I've never regretted it for a single day. The revelation hit Shaq like a physical blow. All these years he'd thought Bobby's extra attention was just kindness, just good coaching. He'd never known that his mentor had put everything on the line for him. You could have lost your job, Shaq whispered. Son, I was 52 years old with 2 kids in college and a mortgage. Of course I could have lost my job. But some things are more important than job security. Sometimes you have to stand up for what you believe in, even when it's risky. Margaret finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. He came home that night and told me what he'd done. I was terrified, but I was also proud. That's the man I married. Someone who fights for what's right. Shaq stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his massive frame shaking with silent sobs. The weight of this revelation was overwhelming. All his success, all his achievements, they might never have happened if Bobby Coleman hadn't taken a stand in a meeting room 30 years ago. Why didn't you ever tell me? Shaq asked without turning around. Because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything. Your success had to come from you, from your work, from your heart. I just made sure you got the chance to show what you were made of. Shaq turned back to face Bobby, his eyes red but determined. I do owe you everything, Bobby. Everything I am. Everything I've accomplished. It all started with you believing in me when nobody else would. No, son, Bobby said with a gentle smile. You don't owe me anything. But if you want to honor what we built together, you keep doing what you're doing. Keep being a father to your kids the way you never had a father. Keep using your platform to help other people. Keep being the man I knew you could become. The room fell silent again, but this time it was filled with a different kind of peace. 3 decades of unspoken gratitude and love had finally found their voice. There's one more thing, Bobby said, reaching toward his bedside table. Margaret, can you get that envelope? Margaret handed him a thick manila envelope, and Bobby's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside were dozens of newspaper clippings, photos, and what appeared to be letters. Every time you won a championship, every time you made a business deal that helped other people, every time I saw you on TV being a good father to your kids, I wrote you a letter. I never sent them because I didn't want to bother you, but I wrote them. 30 years of letters, Shaquille. 30 years of a proud father figure telling you how proud he was. Margaret quietly excused herself to make dinner. sensing that the two men needed these final moments alone. The Louisiana evening was settling in, casting long shadows across the room where two generations of basketball history sat together, bound by something far deeper than the sport that had brought them together. Shaq carefully leafed through the letters Bobby had written over the years. Each one was dated, each one filled with pride, encouragement, and fatherly love. Letters celebrating his NBA championships, letters offering comfort during his divorce, letters expressing joy at his children's accomplishments, letters praising his business ventures and philanthropy. December 15, 2000. Shaq read aloud from one letter. My dear Shaquille, I watched you win your first championship tonight, and I cried like a baby. Not because of the basketball, but because I could see the joy on your face, the pure happiness of achieving something you'd worked so hard for. That's the face of the young man I knew you could become. Your old coach is proud of you, son. Bobby watched Shaq's face as he read, memorizing every expression. I wrote that one the night you beat Indiana in the finals. You played like a man possessed. I was thinking about you during that series, Shaq admitted. Every time I felt tired or frustrated, I heard your voice. Champions are made when nobody's watching, Shaquille. The work you do when it's hard, when you don't want to do it, that's what separates good players from great ones. They spent the next hour going through letters, each one a window into 3 decades of unwavering support and love. Some were short notes of encouragement, others were longer reflections on life, fatherhood, and success. All of them were written with the careful hand of a man who understood the power of words to heal, encourage, and inspire. As the sun set completely, Margaret returned with a plate of Bobby's favorite foods. Foods he could barely eat anymore, but that filled the room with the comfort of home cooking. She also brought something else, a photo album. This is what Bobby really wanted you to see, she said, setting the album on Shaq's lap. The first page contained photos from Shaq's college days, pictures Shaq had never seen before. Bobby at games, Bobby at practices, Bobby in quiet moments, always watching, always caring. But as Shaq turned the pages, he realized this wasn't just about his basketball career. There were photos of other young men, other players Bobby had mentored over the years. 12 NBA players, Bobby said weakly, his voice now barely above a whisper. 43 college graduates who never would have finished school without extra help. 16 young men who went on to become coaches themselves. That's not my legacy, Shaquille. That's our legacy. Every person you've helped, every kid you've mentored, every time you've used your success to lift someone else up. That's the ripple effect of what we started here 30 years ago. Shaq's hands trembled as he turned to the final page of the album. There, carefully preserved, was the first letter he'd ever written to Bobby Coleman, sent during his rookie year with the Orlando Magic. In his young, uncertain handwriting, he'd written, Dear Coach Bobby, I know I don't say it enough, but thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. I promise I'll make you proud. Love, Shaq. You kept this? Shaq whispered. It's been on my nightstand for 30 years, Bobby replied. Every morning when I wake up, I see that promise. And every morning, I smile because you've kept it every single day since. The medical equipment's quiet beeping seemed to slow, and Margaret moved closer to her husband's side. Bobby's breathing was becoming more labored, but his eyes remained fixed on Shaq with absolute clarity. I need you to promise me something, Bobby said, his voice growing faint. Anything. Promise me you'll keep being a father to young men who need one. Promise me you'll keep showing the world that true strength comes from lifting others up, not knocking them down. Promise me that when people remember Shaquille O'Neal, they'll remember not just the basketball player, but the man who used his blessings to bless others. I promise, Shaq said, tears streaming freely down his face. I promise, Bobby. Bobby Coleman smiled one last time, squeezed Shaq's massive hand with all the strength he had left, and whispered, "That's my boy. That's my champion." He closed his eyes peacefully as Margaret held his other hand, and Shaq sat vigil through the night, holding the hand of the man who had shaped his destiny with nothing more than belief, patience, and unconditional love. 3 days later, at Bobby Coleman's funeral, Shaquille O'Neal stood before a packed church in Baton Rouge and delivered a eulogy that would be remembered as one of the most powerful tributes ever given. He spoke not of basketball achievements or fame, but of a quiet man who had seen greatness in a scared teenager and had the courage to nurture it into reality. "Coach Bobby Coleman saved my life," Shaq concluded, his voice echoing through the EEU sanctuary. "He taught me that being big isn't about your size. It's about the size of your heart, the size of your dreams, and the size of your commitment to helping others reach theirs. I am who I am today because 30 years ago, a man I barely knew decided I was worth saving. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that faith." As mourners filed out of the church, many of them former players whose lives had been touched by Bobby Coleman's quiet influence, it became clear that the coach's greatest victory wasn't any game he'd ever won. It was the army of young men he'd sent into the world, armed with confidence, character, and the understanding that true greatness comes from service to others. This incredible story reminds us that behind every success, there's often an unsung hero who believed when no one else would. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories, and share this with someone who needs to hear about the power of mentorship and belief. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to change a life forever. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey, and remember, you never know whose life you might change by simply believing in their potential.